Hello and welcome to the Bitcoinlens podcast. This is episode 13 today. Can you believe it? And today we're going to be talking about Bitcoin and the US election update. So I kind of figured we're in election season right now. We're roughly just over 20 days away from the US election. So I figured we'll kind of give a little update on that as well after we cover some of the Bitcoin news here today. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. So first of all, Gary Gensler being sued and the SEC. They're being sued by Crypto.com. And kind of the background behind this is they gave Crypto.com a Wells notice. What the Wells notice is basically it just basically means the SEC, they're trying to bring enforcement against some kind of entity. And in this case, it was Crypto.com. So just following the patterns of Gary Gensler and the SEC, that is kind of what it looks like. He's the way he approaches regulation against crypto and Bitcoin is he goes and he sues companies first, and then, whatever the outcome of the lawsuit is, that's kind of how the regulation will follow. But interesting one there, Crypto.com hitting back, and they're targeting SEC and Gary Gensler. Next up, Hong Kong. This is some very positive news here. Hong Kong to approve more Bitcoin and crypto exchanges this year. Most recently, I saw there was up to 11 applications, and these could all be approved by end of year, which is obviously pretty soon. So good news there for Hong Kong. Moving on to Argentina. Now, the Argentina president, Javier Milei, he obviously met with Nayib Bukele, went down to El Salvador, and Bukele went to Argentina as well. And there may be a big chance that Argentina adopts a similar strategy. So I saw through a few references there that they're looking at, and they're very interested in the volcano mining aspect of El Salvador. And if you're not familiar with that, I talked about that quite a bit there in the last episode there with Jan Stallion. And he kind of lived in El Salvador, so a good one to watch there or listen to there. But so essentially, Argentina. The point I'm trying to make here is they want to try and possibly adopt a similar type Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy or a treasury strategy. And they were also very interested in Nayib Bukele's volcano mining that he's been doing there. So they've been essentially funding Bitcoin mining through volcano mining. And that's kind of where they get the energy from. And then they're also selling volcano bonds on top of that to essentially give you some kind of yield on top of that. As an investor, you get a little yield off the volcano bond. And then the funding of those volcano bonds is essentially what funds the Bitcoin mining. So interesting stuff there, and in creative ways there to kind of leverage, energy for Bitcoin mining and then making money through that via bonds. So Argentina very interested in that, and so I'm curious to see, where this will lead. But yeah, in a nutshell, if you don't know, Nayib Bukele, El Salvador, he buys 1 Bitcoin a day, and he started adopting Bitcoin model for his country back in 2020 and gave each citizen $30 worth of Bitcoin to kick that program off. But yeah, more to come on that. I just want to quickly mention that because this is kind of promising news. Now, moving on to Bahrain in the Middle East. So the National Bank of Bahrain, they launched their first Bitcoin investment product. So it's basically a Bitcoin investment fund. Now, this is basically created for institutional investors in the Middle East Gulf Cooperation Council. And this was formed by Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And this investment fund was essentially developed in partnership with the digital asset firm ARP Digital. So really, really good information there. Good, very optimistic signs there for the Middle East being exposed to a nice Bitcoin investment fund there launched by the National Bank of Bahrain. And obviously, we know there's a lot of money in that part of the world. So great to see some exposure there to a Bitcoin investment fund. Now, staying in the Middle East, the UAE eliminated, and I saw this week, they eliminated value added tax on all cryptocurrency and digital asset transfers. So just to be clear, this is not tax removal on just crypto holding crypto assets, but it's the transfer of that. So any crypto transactions are exempt from having that value added tax added to it, which is a 5% levy essentially in the UAE. Now this takes effect November 15th, and the interesting piece about this, it applies retrospectively back to transactions starting in January 1st, 2018. So they'll apply this retrospectively all the way back and retroactively, excuse me, to 2018, January 1st. And yeah, so this is really promising news there for the UAE and UAE Bitcoin and crypto holders there. 5% little tax they're just shaving off the top of those transactions. Moving on to some of the central banks, some global central bank news. So Norwegian and Swiss central banks are buying MicroStrategy shares. So if you don't know, MicroStrategy is the largest Bitcoin corporation in the Bitcoin holder slash corporation in the U.S. and they hold 252,000 Bitcoin. So Norway Central Bank, they are buying 1.1 million MicroStrategy shares, and the Swiss Central Bank's buying 466,000 MicroStrategy shares. So some interesting creative ways to expose yourself to Bitcoin without exposing yourself directly to Bitcoin, doing it via a company who's pro Bitcoin and arguably the most pro Bitcoin corporation in the world. So very, very interesting there. And as a side note there, I thought it was kind of interesting, just kind of refresh my memory when I saw this. And in middle of July, Goldman Sachs and some other wealth managers like BlackRock and Fidelity also invested millions of dollars in MSTR. So most of us would know BlackRock, Fidelity as holding or giving us access to Bitcoin ETFs. But yeah, that was pretty interesting. Middle of last year, they actually bought millions of MSTR shares. Moving on to UBS. So, UBS is one of the largest and powerful wealth management firms on earth. And they're advising their investors to reduce US dollar holdings. So, I've kind of been sounding like a broken record when it comes to US dollar holdings, US dollar treasuries. And as we see China, Japan offloading US treasuries, other countries offloading treasuries, holding the lowest amount of US treasuries, or more plainly said, US debt in the last 50 years. This is kind of interesting coming from a major Western bank, UBS. And they're basically predicting further long term currency debasement. Just to kind of give you an idea how big UBS is, they've got $595 billion assets under management, and they've got a goal for 2028 to get to 5 trillion assets under management. So, not a small bank here. And, I know I've been giving updates on some of these big banks making announcements like this and adopting Bitcoin, but really it doesn't get too much bigger than a bank like UBS. Moving on to South Korea. So, good news here for Korea. They're looking to allow institutions to buy Bitcoin and crypto, as well as lifting the ban on cryptocurrency ETFs. So, you're going to see some exposure to these ETFs coming from Korea. And keep in mind, when you see these exposures to ETFs, new exposure to ETFs, this all drastically impacts the price of Bitcoin. Arguably, probably has the most impact on the price of Bitcoin. You saw this week the U.S. government sold 70,000 Bitcoin that they seized from the Silk Road. Silk Road seized Bitcoin back in the day. This is like from a decade ago. So stolen Bitcoin off Silk Road, the Silk Road platform, basically a dark market for all kinds of exchanges on there or trading of things on there. But yeah, 70,000 Bitcoin the US government sold this week. Absolutely mind numbing. You're selling Bitcoin, which is the most finite, most scarce, and most widely adopted rate, right now in the last few years of adoption through ETFs and all these things. They're selling that for printer money. They're selling it for a shitcoin. Fiat currency, US dollar, it's a shitcoin. We're literally selling the hardest asset that's widely adopted in the world for something that they can print and something that's being debased every day, and something that is possibly moving away as being the king and being the global reserve currency of the world. We're going to have more to come here very soon, and probably going to have this on next week update. But remember, they're announcing their new currency. So they're going to be announcing their currency in Moscow at the BRICS summit. So very interesting to see, but really mind-numbing and really just very disappointing to see the U.S. government once again selling an ample amount of Bitcoin, 70,000. But great news for South Korea. They're allowing institutions to buy Bitcoin and crypto and giving them some exposure there. So if you don't want to hear anything about the elections, this would be the time to tune off. But I just wanted to give a quick little update for those of you maybe not too in tune about it. Now, I'm seeing, because this ties into geopolitics. Bitcoin ties into geopolitics. It ties into, our governments, who the leaders are, who the governors are, who the senators are, who the presidents are, who the mayors are, all the way down to councilmen, corporations, CEOs. So geopolitics and business and all these things all tie in very closely to Bitcoin. So it's very important to keep that in mind as you cast your vote this November 5th. So Bitwise CIO. So Bitwise, they've got a big ETF as well. One of the original ETFs this year, one of the first ETFs this year. The Bitwise CIO says Bitcoin will hit $80,000 in Q4 if the Republicans win or Trump wins. The $37 billion wealth manager Bernstein predicts Bitcoin could hit 90,000 if Trump wins the election. Now, do I take these prices serious? Absolutely not. It could be way lower, it could be way higher, but I do think that, it is important to look at who's the more pro Bitcoin candidate, if that's a key policy for you, or a key part of why you're voting for someone. So the polls are super tight. So I saw as recent as today, the internal Trump and Kamala Harris polls are showing that Trump is leading the majority of swing states. And Polymarket is showing Trump pulling away. If you're not familiar with Polymarket, this is actually where you can actually bet on this election, and they're showing him pull away. As recent as like 2-3 weeks ago, I saw it like really tight. It was like 49 to 50 in the favor of Kamala, actually, like right after the debate. It was a few weeks ago. And as recent as today, I saw it stretch out to 56, 40, 43 or something like that in favor of Trump. So Polymarket showing Trump pulling away. Real Clear Politics, which they're also super neutral, shows Trump has 70% chance of winning the electoral college. And if you're not in the US, if you don't know how the elections work here, the popular vote doesn't matter. You win the electoral college, you win the election. So basically each state has electoral college votes, and if yours add up to 270 or above, you win the election. Easy as that. CNN also shows 68% chance of Trump winning the electoral college, meaning winning the presidency. And then Pew Research poll, which is typically, I'd say, more left leaning. I mean, I'm not going to go into semantics with that. I think they're pretty neutral. But they're showing Trump to get 312 electoral college votes, which, well, like I said, he needs 270. So everything pointing to Trump right now winning the election, but who knows? I mean, a lot of these are just polls. Polymarket's probably the one I take the most serious in the internal polls, because the internal campaign polls, they've got no incentive to lie. Polymarket's got no incentive to lie, because people will literally lose money if they're betting on, fake polling or fake results there. So, what are the key things I look at personally when selecting my candidate? I'm looking at things. How are things been the last 4 years? I'm seeing energy prices are up over 30% since Trump left office. Now, some may say, "Oh, well, I've got an EV. It doesn't affect me." No, energy prices, oil prices affect every single thing in your life. It affects the full supply chain. It affects every single thing probably that you're looking around you right now. Everything from your AirPods to your monitor to the chair you're sitting in to the couch you're sitting on. It affects everything. So if energy prices go up, it affects all that stuff. Anyway, I'm not going to go into an energy lesson here. The current inflation rate based on the CPI, the Consumer Price Index model, shows 2.4%, Now, before I ramble on about how that number is wrong, I will say it is consistently wrong. So it's always wrong. And under Trump, under any Republican, under any Democrat, that number is always wrong. The problem is it goes based on the cost of living index. So this is a random bucket the government or the Bureau of Labor and Statistics decide on, and this is just basically on cost of living. They determine that everything's gone up 2.4%. If you look at GovFlation, I highly recommend you go check out the GovFlation website. That's based on the cost of goods index, and that's actually going to go on the actual price we pay for things, which is based on the 9080 Bureau of Labor and Statistics metric. They went off the cost of goods, and that's 10.3% right now, which is significantly higher than what it was 4 years ago. So that's hurting people. That's hurting people, and that's going to be a key factor. So unless inflation can get under control, which you got 3 weeks left, I don't see how you're going to keep office. Obviously Kamala is not Biden, but she was his vice president. So I don't know how you kind of sell yourself out of that one. You look at illegal border crossings, that's a tough one for a lot of people. 10 to 20 million in the last 4 years. That's affecting the whole economy, which in turn is going to be indirectly affecting everything, and probably is going to be good for global adoption of Bitcoin or US adoption of Bitcoin, because everything's going to get debased so much because the welfare state will increase, which means we're going to have more currency debasement, which means folks will try and store their wealth in a different means, which means Bitcoin's probably going to soar. So if you're going to be selfish and you don't care about anyone else, you could just say, hey, this is going to be good for Bitcoin. Let's bring in more illegals. That's great. My Bitcoin price going to go up. Probably not a great way to look at it, but there's something interesting there. So moving on to wars, we're spending right now 175 billion on the Ukraine war. So that's a big one for me. Trump, he didn't start any new wars. I mean, honestly, no war started under him, and the Ukraine Russia war didn't start under him. And I truly believe it is due to him, and I think he had a serious impact on that. You look at housing, housing is going through the roof. Housing, 1 in 3 buyers are cash buyers in the US right now. If you looked about 7, 8 years ago, you could get an interest rate of about 2.5% on a 30-year fixed mortgage loan for a house. Right now, you're looking at 7.4, 7.5% interest rate on a 30-year mortgage. That's why houses are not selling like they did under Trump. It's unbelievable how slow the market's moving right now. Even airline fares, if you travel frequently, hell, I felt the pain of that recently, seeing how pretty close flights to myself, like what would traditionally been $200-300, are now for the same flight, $500-600. So I can really feel that one, especially. Kamala, one thing I would completely step away from if I was her, the unrealized gains taxes. I've heard some word where she didn't really mean that, or that's not really going to be something she's pushing. I doubt that, even if she's a firm believer in that, which I don't even think she's going to pursue that. I don't think that's going to even pass Congress. There's no chance. There's just too many wealthy people that's going to be affected by unrealized gains taxes. Capital gains increases. She is proposing to increase the capital gains tax, long-term capital gains, from 21% to 28%. Trump cut that from 35% to 21%. So she's proposing that for any earners over 1 million a year. So I'm not a big fan of that. If you're making more than that, get more taxes on you. What happens if you keep taxing the rich? It sounds good in theory, right? Let's tax the rich. You get a wealth drain, so everyone will they'll move their assets, they'll move their businesses to foreign countries, and essentially you're just hurting yourself. You're collecting more tax percentage, but you're collecting way less revenue. So I think she needs to step away from that one if she wants to get more moderate, even Republican votes. On top of the 28% capital gains, that'll also be for Kamala. That'll be a 5% net investment income tax as well on top of that. So you're essentially looking for a net total of 33% total on earners 1 million and above. So really massive there. And keep in mind, Trump did double the standard deduction in 2017, I believe. 2017, he did double the standard deduction, meaning that's not for the rich, right? This is folks that don't itemize, they don't have assets, they don't have houses, they don't have businesses. These are folks just using a straight up W 2, work for a company, get a W 2. Your standard deduction has doubled under Trump. So that's going to expire at the end of 2025. So, probably a key thing there, unless you're selfish, you don't care about folks poorer than you, and you don't care how that impacts them, I'd say don't worry about that one. For me personally, I don't want people with a W-2 that have double standard deduction. I don't want them to get half the standard deduction. So that's a key one for me. And then finally, if none of that really matters to you, what I just said there between the two candidates, I just look at who's more pro Bitcoin. I was at the Bitcoin conference this year. It was no comparison. Trump was there, RFK was there, Vivek was there. I'm just looking at patterns. The Gensler, how he's been against the crypto community. That's a Biden appointee. I just look at these things and I'm looking at who's calling for CBDCs. That's coming from the Democratic side. That's coming from the Elizabeth Warren side of the House. I'm looking at these things and that kind of scares me a little bit. But yeah, I just wanted to give a little election update there. Of course, make your own informed decision, research, research, research. What's more important for you? Just ask yourself, what's your worldview? Like, do you want a country that's safe? Do you want a country with lower taxes? Do you want a country where everyone's prosperous, not just the wealthy, not just you? Just kind of ask yourself those things. But, I don't want to derail us too much there into the political side of things. I just think it's important right now. The geopolitics really, really plays in hard into Bitcoin and the price. Honestly, I think either candidate winning it's gonna spike Bitcoin price. There's gonna be a net spike. I think under Trump there'll be a bigger spike, but under Kamala I think there'll be also a spike because I think the wars will continue, and I think currency debasement will continue, which means more folks will want that exposure either directly or through ETFs to Bitcoin to preserve their wealth. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening. I'll tune in next week and I'll see you later.